My mission is to teach history through art and to make people think more critically about false narratives. I'm Jim McMurtry, and welcome to my classroom. The art that we're looking at today isn't a painting, it's a drawing, it's a political cartoon done by Americans. And it leads us to a false narrative. And I will explain as we go on. And as you can see in the cartoon, it's a picture of a drawing of Sitting Bull. Now, Sitting Bull was a prominent indigenous chief of the great Sioux nation. Different names for them: Dakota, Lakota, Oglala, Hunkpapa. There's all sorts of names for them. And the background I'll explain in a minute with Sitting Bull. But the cartoon itself was ridicule somewhat the British in Canada. You see a picture there. In the bottom left part of the cartoon, we have a sign. It says, "Please keep off our territory, John Bull and Bull." Now, John Bull is the character in the middle, and so that's just a caricature of an English person with a red face and high boots and erect and stiff upper lip and all those things. So that's ridicule. But the point of the cartoon was to say we don't want the British in the U.S., the English in the U.S., or Sitting Bull. And so when it comes to Sitting Bull, now maybe one last thing, and that is with regard to, you see the caricature of an American, which is Uncle Sam there, getting the boot from Sitting Bull, because that, I guess, relates. This is my interpretation anyway. And not everything in history is easy to say with absolute authority. I was looking at when Sitting Bull came to Canada after the battle I'm going to be talking about, and half the sources said 1876, and the other half said the next year. So again, I think most of what people say with any historical foundation is likely to be correct, but not necessarily everything. And I'm hoping right with the things that I am telling you today, with the exception of that date. So, what happened in the United States, same thing that happened in Canada today, is you have migrants coming to the West. People wanting to escape for all sorts of reasons: famine, religious persecution, war, disease, all sorts of reasons. People getting on boats and coming to the Americas. And as they started moving west into what is now the Black Hills area, that's sort of the area where the Sitting Bull came to great fame. And that the Black Hills area is a mountain range that touches on states, including Montana and Wyoming. And the typical rendering of the story is that the white Europeans kept moving further and further west, encroaching on land that had been given by treaty to the Sioux, and eventually the cavalry, the army, was called in to protect the settlers because the indigenous people weren't very happy losing their treaty lands that had been promised to them after already losing much more land, and to see that being lost as well. And there's some truth to that, because there were more and more settlers pouring in to the western part of the United States, as in Canada. And among them were a lot of prospectors, people looking for gold, because there was gold found in those mountains. But another part of the story, which isn't told, is that in the treaties that were signed with different indigenous groups and the tribes in the western part of the United States, where there was a treaty with the Crow Indians, and at least that's the Crow was the name that was given to them at the time. And they weren't happy with the Sioux encroaching on their land, and they petitioned the American government to get the Sioux out of their land. So it's a bit of a mess. I think that's probably true, with people with obviously competing land claims to land anywhere in the world, and we're certainly seeing that in Canada now with the land back movement and so forth. The story of Sitting Bull is this: so the last major war, and one that was won at any rate, by the Indigenous people was called the Battle of the Little Big Horn in 1876. And very famously, George Custer lost that battle, and was his 7th Cavalry was wiped out. And I'm very interested in that. Bit of a history buff, as you can see. I even went to the area where the battle was, and stopped and supped or ate at a little village of Custer, Montana, just north where the battle took place. The census of 2000, it had only 145 people. Anyhow, it's sort of interesting. There's several Custers, towns called Custer. Um, anyhow, so the I don't want to go in deeply into the battle, other than to say that the American army obviously didn't expect to lose. They didn't go in full force. Custer wanted to get all the glory for himself and thought he could take on what turned out to be a very large conglomerate, confederation of native groupings, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and others. And there were, of course, native allies fighting alongside the Custer's 7th U.S. Army, Cavalry. Anyhow, so once the battle was over, more American soldiers were sent west, and the Sioux didn't have a chance, or the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and others. So they they agreed in most part to go settle on reservations and not cause any further trouble. And they recognize, and this is an important thing to note, and that is if you have two groups of people who are claiming the same land, and all through history this is played out, the one that's likely to win is the one that has the better social organization and the better military technology, or technology generally. And so the Sitting Bull and the Sioux recognized that they weren't going to win against the Europeans in the United States, against the American government. And Sitting Bull, as I said earlier, either 1876 or 1877, crossed into Canada. And that's really the false narrative that I want to point out, not the fact that people can't agree on the year, but the fact that today there are a number of Sioux reserves there are over 600 reserves in Canada assigned to given over to Indigenous groupings, but there are a number of them that are given over to the Sioux, and two fairly large ones. And they're around the area where Sitting Bull crossed over in around 1876, 77. And that's the Cypress Hills area of southern Saskatchewan, which it's fun for me because I've been there because of a sister that lives in Regina. And so that's kind of leading me to the conclusion of this. Sitting Bull came to Canada in 1876 or 1877. He ultimately went back and ended up dying about 13, 14 years later, and being shot in a dispute. But really, what I want to focus on is the Sioux, not Sitting Bull, but the Sioux as a grouping, as a, we can call them nation, what everyone wants to call tribe. They stayed in Canada and they have full rights as Indigenous people. But they came over long after people in my family came to Canada, which was home called British North America, but came to Canada. So this is the false narrative. The false narrative in Canada is we've given all sorts of names. And it's frustrating being a teacher because I'm working with as a teacher, I was working largely with kids from other parts of the world. So I try and simplify everything for them. And it's hard to do when there's so many different names for our native people, our Indigenous people. And the one that was used when I was young, and for most of history since Columbus came and thought he was in India, Indios, and they called them Indians or Indios ever since. He thought he was in India, but of course he found a new planet, which is about a third of the world's surface. So it was incredible find by Columbus. So called Indian, it's still a legal term in Canada because we have the Indian Act, and the Indian Act governs the relationship between our Indigenous people and the crown, the government. And that has been amended, but it's still there, and it's still again using the word Indian. And I have a colleague, had a colleague, a teaching friend who was disciplined for because he used the word Indian in the classroom. So it was once something that was the name we used, and but we can't anymore as teachers. And after that, we ended up going to different. I've heard Indian went to Amerindian, went to Native, Native American, Aboriginal, lots of different names. And recently, I'm not sure how the consensus was reached, but recently as a society, here in Canada, and increasingly the United States, and in perhaps other parts of the world as well, although in New Zealand it still tends to be Maori. Um, and as you know, there's different names in Aborigine, for example, in Australia. So Canada, we're using Indigenous, and yet the name Indigenous is, first of all, it's an adjective. So when you talk about a people, all we are afforded by the English language is an adjective. And then there's the problem, of course, that Indigenous means simply from where one is from. And any of us who were born in Canada would see ourselves as being Indigenous. And the most absurd thing of all is the United Nations put out maps and so on of showing all the Indigenous people in the world. And there's Indigenous people everywhere, except in Europe. Apparently, Europeans are the only people that can't be Indigenous to anywhere, that can't benefit from the title and increasingly the benefits that come from being able to say, I'm Indigenous. And so that in itself is an absurdity. So again, I'm using art to speak to false narratives. And it's particularly setting to me as a teacher that I can't use any term to me is accurate. I'm not sure a band such as a Semiamu, which was close to where I live in White Rock in southwestern BC, south of Vancouver, with just over 100 people living on the reserve, could be called a nation. I'm not sure the Sioux or the Iroquois, many others, should be called First Nations because, again, they came here long after many of my ancestors arrived on these shores. So that's the problem. We need to, as a society, if we are going to bring about this much vaunted truth and reconciliation, I think we should slow down, not only figure out what the truth is about our past, not only trying to understand what are we reconciling anyway, and why is it one-sided when you consider that all is being done for Indigenous people more than any other country in the world. Canada has done incredible things for its Indigenous people. We need to come up with a term that people can use and be comfortable with. So I think we need to again slow down and sit in a room all across the country and say, look, none of this makes any sense. And maybe we should just simply do what the makers of our Constitution imagined. And as recently as the people who brought back our Constitution of Britain in 1982, officially, it was done in 1881, which my father was one of the participants, McMurtry, and that is to give Canadians, all Canadians, the same equal rights. Thank you.